Hello everybody, welcome to Google, welcome to Noisy Thinking for our third of this year's series. I'm Sarah Newman, I'm the director of the APG, and I'm going to start with a few very important thank yous. The first is to Google for hosting us once again in this lovely venue, providing us with delicious drinks and the chance for a chat. We're really grateful for all your hard work. Thanks also to Flamingo, our wonderful sponsor, with whom none of these provocative and hopefully interesting evenings would happen. And thanks also to Tracy Follows, the APG chair, who inspired this evening's theme and who sadly can't be here this evening. But we'll see her soon. It's interesting for me to be up on the stage talking about this, if in brief, because I'm not a speaker but an introducer, because I'm very pleased that we're giving lots of oxygen to what is a very important topic. But I'm kind of horrified that in 2014 we're still having this conversation. Many years ago, 20 years ago I think, when I was at Ogilvy and I was a young planner, I was very involved in a big research project we did amongst women to try and get rid of the whole idea of the housewife, to take the housewife off the brief and out of the planning thinking, as we felt it was so inhibiting to really good advertising that connected with women. And the research project felt very groundbreaking. We did a great conference, got lots of publicity. Some things changed. But I wonder whether enough has changed, and I wonder why we are still dealing in so many of the cliches around women, which are so well worn, and why we're so lazy sometimes in our thinking. So, ever vigilant as the APG, we thought we'd give lots of oxygen to this subject this evening, and it kind of goes well with the themes that we've had so far this year, as we've talked about what makes a good insight and what makes a good brief. And the target audience is a fundamental part of all of our thinking. So tonight it's about women. And we're very lucky to have four fantastic speakers. The first on this evening is Jane Cunningham, former planning director of Ogilvy and my boss.
Still am, Sarah.
I know, I'm absolutely terrified. She's co-founder, as many of you know, with Philippa Roberts of Inside Her Pretty Little Head, which is a consultancy devoted to helping brands and clients connect better with women. And she's going to be setting the scene by talking about how companies targeting men tend to have a culture that leaches into their communications and some of the ways that you can go around that. Rachel Pashley, planning group head at JWT, who works primarily on women's healthcare with JWT and travels all around the world talking to women and understanding more about them, and has used a lot of that thinking, plus some very interesting research she's done, to inform her work on female tribes. Kate Smither, who's a relatively new import to these shores, having worked in Australia most of her life as a planner, who is multi-awarded for her work on Dove and a number of other brands, and who's going to talk to us this evening about how you can get it right and what we might learn from that. And finally, Mr. Richard Huntington, Head of Strategy at Saatchi and Saatchi, and no stranger to this stage, whose recent study in association with Mumsnet is designed to make the use of the word mum entirely redundant. Marvellous. But not mums. No, let's not do that. Okay, so Jane, would you like to come off and kick off the evening?
Have your phone just to...
Oh, the sofa.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And just to clarify, nobody has ever been Sarah's boss, least of all me. Great, well, it's really nice to be here, and it's really brilliant for this subject to be discussed. Embarrassingly, the first slide is of the book that we wrote, which it isn't really supposed to be there, but there are some free books on the table at the end if you'd like to take one. But the reason that we wrote the book really is because we had observed, as lots of you will have observed, that advertising can be very alienating to women. Oh, here's a whole lift full of people arriving. Managed to work out how the lift worked right. Okay, but I think what we would say is that, all advertising doesn't alienate all women, but there are some categories that are really, really good at alienating women. And those categories tend to be, we would say, financial services, technology, automotive, and alcohol clients. Most of you, I guess, will have relationships with some or all of those types of organizations. And the reasons that those people are really, or those marketing people tend to be bad at or good at alienating women is because, not because they're idiots or because they're sexist. And we spend a lot of time talking to people in these organizations. And it's not because they're really ignorant even. it's really because they're using the wrong tools for the job. And what they're doing is they're taking marketing tools that have been designed traditionally to target men, and they're redeploying them without any kind of modification in order to then try and attract a female audience. And that's because there's an underlying assumption in these organizations. The theme in the book is tools. It's not a kind of just random crass joke. Anyway, so but the kind of primary assumption and wrong assumption that these organizations make is that men and women are the same, when in fact, as we all know, men and women are in fact quite different. And I'm about to kind of now do the entire kind of history of gender difference in 3 slides. So apologies to all the great scientists out there who've done this work. And I'm first going to reduce the work of one man, Simon Baron-Cohen, to 2 slides, who came up with a really interesting summary, I guess, of gender difference and a totalizing theory of gender difference. And he says that human beings make sense of the world in 2 fundamentally different ways: systemizing and empathizing. Systemizing being essentially a sort of analytical process. It's about looking at a problem, looking at a situation, looking at the system that is in operation within that situation, and trying to decode or deconstruct or understand the underlying rules in order to therefore control the system ultimately. And then there's empathizing, which is a word that people are probably a bit more familiar with, which is about putting yourself into the shoes of other people in order to feel what they're feeling and to experience what they're experiencing. And the payoff here is not about control, it's about emotional connection. And what he did, because he's a massive systemizer basically, was do a huge study of adults looking at their tendencies and preferences. And what he found is that on average, men will tend to systemizing, and on average, women will tend to empathizing. And those words are carefully chosen, on average. There is a spectrum, and most of us exist on that spectrum rather than at one end or the other. And there are many other pretty well documented differences between men and women, and this just looks like a list of sort of prejudices that I've made up when it's kind of put up like this. But I promise you, it's a very kind of nuanced and well-researched area, and you can look to the primary text to understand them in great detail if you don't believe me. But the summary, I guess, of the gender difference that we think is really helpful when understanding how and why to market to women is that the masculine will tend to have an interest in systems, whereas the feminine tends to be an urge towards people and empathy. The masculine tends to control, the feminine tends to connection. The masculine preference is to understand what is, whereas the feminine tends to try and understand what could be or what the possibilities are. The masculine tends to respond to new stimulus in a way that tries to justify or prove that what currently exists or the status quo is exactly the right thing to be doing, whereas the feminine will tend to play more of a devil's advocate role. The masculine preference in proof points is for argument, linearity, and the explicit, so the stuff that's on the surface rather than in the subtext. The feminine much more about feeling, meaning, and the implicit. And the survival instinct, and I guess the evolutionary theorists, there is the kind of great blanket kind of statements about how people go about passing on their genes, but there have been very interesting studies done now, I guess, in that field to say that actually the survival instinct is actually quite different in the masculine and the feminine. The masculine, I guess, in the kind of traditional received wisdom, being about fight or flight and using competition and scale to beat off those who are competing for their resources, whereas the feminine tending to respond to stress in a tend and befriend way and looking to reduce risk and look for safety. And then in organisation and structure, the masculine tends to be happier and more contented, and the default mode of preference tends to be around working independently and in a hierarchy, whereas the feminine tends to be more cooperative. So there you go. That's a whistle-stop tour of everything that's known about gender difference. But I guess more interestingly from our point of view is that it's not just people who have preferences. Corporate cultures have preferences too, because they're full of people, and they're often full of people who are quite like each other. So if you get lots of systemizers in an organization, they'll probably hire lots of systemizers, and then you end up with a systemizing organization. It's quite easy to tell a systemizing organization because they normally have massive receptions and lots of glass and chrome and have a logo which is a bull or a lion or something. But basically, systemizing corporate cultures look and feel a bit like this. And this will remind you, I guess, of the first point that I was making about financial services, automotive, booze clients and technology clients. But their core competence will tend to be about making or providing systems, or manufacturing, which is effectively a system which is constantly sort of bettering itself. The approach to customer relationships will be control, so it'll be about locking the customer in and locking competitors out. The organizational structure will be hierarchical, or a series of hierarchies. They will only trust quantitative measurement, and they'll distrust nuance, grey areas, intuition, hunches, or anything like that. And they'll really enjoy measurement against previous performance. And retailers are really good at this, aren't they? It's always kind of, how did we do this day last year? Direct, almost day-to-day comparisons. And then the approach to surviving will be about size and scale. So they're often big penetration driving categories, which are all about kind of being number one, getting to be number one, having massive volume share effectively of the category. And they'll focus often on intra-category competition. And that's, I guess, classically automotive. You know, they care much more about the motor show than they do about the people driving the car, because all they care about is that new car has come out and it's got X, so we better get one too. And that's their sort of yearly, annual obsession. And that would be all fine if all that stuff stayed inside the organisation. But of course what happens is that corporate culture leaks out all over the advertising and all out of the external presentation to their consumers. And systemisers will tend to present exactly in the likeness of their corporate culture. So you'll find that they have a very strong belief in the machine. So the product will be the kind of supreme being in the advertising. And you rarely see people actually in arch sort of systematic advertising, but often the product is genuinely king. The orientation of the proposition will be self-centered. So it will start from the point of view of I am the company, I've got this amazing product, I'm going to tell you how magnificent my product is, and sort of argue with you until you believe it, with all the amazing proof points that I have. And new product development. I love the Gillette thing, because it's so brilliant because it targets men, but it's brilliantly systematic. How many blades, or how sharp can a blade actually be? It's just sort of unthinkably sharp. But new product development will tend to be about taking an existing formula and just sort of endlessly edging it ever better with tiny kind of incremental changes, rather than those great sort of leaps, I guess, that one might expect from a more empathetic organisation. And the character of the relationship will be expert. So loads of jargon and process in advertising that comes out of systematic organisations, because that's the way they can prove that they know more than you, and you should therefore listen to them. And the intent in the communication will be very obviously about impressing you. So you see a lot of hyperbole in systematic communication. Automotive being the sort of best example of that, where the claims that they make seem, if you just sort of deconstructed the ad, it looks sort of risible. But the idea this person will travel thousands of miles just to get to sit in this car, or whatever it might be. But I like, it makes you feel like the man you are, which is beautiful. But basically, the intent is to impress the customer into thinking that this product or this brand is absolutely amazing. And of course, that's great if you're talking to systemizers, but if you're talking to empathizers, if you're talking to women, it's profoundly off-putting and profoundly irrelevant. And that's why, all the well-published data about how women think and feel about automotive retailers, how they feel about automotive advertising, how they think and feel about financial services products. They're genuinely underserved by these categories, because they're not serving women at all, and that's because effectively the culture is sort of militate against that happening. So what they should be doing is looking to the empathetic, and there are empathetic organisational cultures that they can learn from, and those will tend to be, and lots of agencies are like this, people service-based organisations where they have a very level relationship with the customer. Employees mirror the customer. John Lewis and Marx is a really good example of that, sort of nice middle-class ladies and gents serving nice middle-class ladies and gents. Teams and networks will be the primary organisational structure. You'll often have a visionary at the top of an empathetic organisation who will talk a lot about beliefs and purpose and why we're here and what we're here to do, compared to our competitors. And the approach to surviving will be much more based on innovation They'll be quality-based, often looking for value share rather than volume share, and depth of customer understanding being the way that you facilitate that kind of loyalty. And empathizers, of course, present very differently to systemizers because they focus on all the things that machines can't do, which is beliefs, purpose, feelings, meaning, sensual stuff, kind of living in the real world, context, understanding how people actually use and might want to use these products. And they'll often behave as a person does rather than a corporation, so they'll have a much kind of smaller people-sized feel to them than a corporation would. And they'll seek to build connections with other people by mirroring the audience, so empathy being particularly critical. So they'll focus on and feature people, so Skoda, I guess, versus BMW. They'll mirror the customer very closely, and Nike has admirably done amazing work really understanding how women think and feel about their bodies and how they think and feel about sport, and mirroring that back at the audience in the work that they do, and share their interests. So they'll genuinely look at the audience, look at the category, look at what they have to offer, and then see where there is some sort of shared ground between them and the audience, rather than it being, I'm on this island, you're on that island, how can I kind of get you over onto my island, because that's where it's convenient for me to be. So they should be out there kind of looking to the empathetic, but of course the problem is that in the game of kind of rock, paper, scissors, what you find is that systemizing always wins in organizations, and the bigger they get, the more systematic they become, because numbers will always beat a hunch or a feeling, and because clarity beats nuance, and because fact always seems to triumph over belief. So it's incredibly difficult for these organizations to sort of get themselves out of the systematic mire that they have ultimately found themselves in. But that's my argument, and that is why I believe advertising does alienate women, and I don't think it's your fault. But I think that advertising is a symptom rather than a cause of the problem. But I think just raising awareness of what is actually going on within those corporate cultures with your clients can genuinely help change the way they do things.
Hello. So I'm going to take you through a slightly different perspective, hopefully some common themes, exploring the subject today. So firstly, I'm going to touch on my favourite subject, which is myself. Not because I'm narcissistic, because I am, but just because I work in women's health and I get to travel the world. And one of the things that really started the female tribes was I couldn't fail to notice in my travels the way in which women are changing. So the first thing that strikes you when you go to Russia or to Asia and you're in a management company is where are the men? Particularly in Russia. Maybe the doorman or the security are male, but you go into the boardroom and it's all female and they look amazing. They can't move their faces very much, but they look amazing. And they're really smart. And why should we care? Well, women are the new emerging market. And when Ernst & Young say that, we really ought to believe it. Over the next decade, and already, women are wielding enormous financial, but also political power. And it's estimated that women control, we always knew women like to shop, but women control nearly 2/3 of the overall global consumer spend. So they're a very influential consumer. So it's inherent on us, as planners, to get this right. And even in terms of managing companies and generating wealth, not just spending wealth, generating it, I've got what we call the Dow Jones effect. So, the greater the number of female board directors, the more successful that company. So it outperforms male-led companies across all financial metrics, all of them, not just one. And equally, when you look at troubled economies, when you have women at the helm, those economies of countries recover much faster. So, they're generators, they're spenders, and they're generators of wealth. And then when you look at, this is the Brand Z study, Millward Brown proprietary tool that looks at the most successful brands. 70% of the top 100 most valuable global brands have women in the boardroom. So again, we create fantastic brands. So, why are we getting it so wrong? Why are women alienated by advertising? Maybe we're complaining a bit too much. Because, nowadays, women have so many important roles. Worried wife of cop, annoying girlfriend of fun guy, mother of heroic son in the acting world. Maybe we're just moaning a bit too much, and maybe we should just shut up. Well, actually, my sarcasm betrays me, because, when you look at advertising, actually women are often in these supportive roles. And here's a little example. So let's have a look at Jaguar.
Have you ever noticed how in Hollywood movies all the villains are played by Brits?
Maybe we just sound right.
Good evening, sir.
Thank you, Mary.
We're more focused, more precise.
We're always one step ahead.
With a certain style, an eye for detail.
And we're obsessed by power. Stiff upper lip is key.
And we all drive Jaguars.
Oh, yes. It's good to be bad.
Did you spot the woman? It's like, come on, it's like James Bond from 50 years ago. Here are your car keys. Now, I don't know about you, I'm a woman, I'm obsessed by power, I'm a megalomaniac. Could we not have had a female villain in there? It's a supporting role. And this is the problem. We view women, not just in advertising, but in society, through a very narrow lens. So she's either busy working mum or neurotic singleton, waiting, praying to be busy working mum. And you're one or the other, and that's your life, apparently. And even when it comes to the filmic world, I think this is more than just the advertising world. Let's look at Hollywood, for example. We award women, but mostly in submissive supporting roles. God forbid she should have an achievement-based role. So only 2 Oscars in the whole history of the Oscars have been awarded to women in achievement-based roles. Great. So, most Oscars are awarded to women as, mother of heroic cop, girlfriend of slightly troubled man. You are at best a supporting role, and only 30% of roles in Hollywood are speaking parts. So we still make silent movies for women, which is very encouraging. And then, we see this with P&G. On the one hand, you can kind of applaud women, you can applaud P&G for supporting women, but actually, if you've ever seen the proud sponsor of mums, it's like they watch Stepford Wives 1 million times, because these women are mute, subservient women, vessels that are just there, live and breathe to create the next little generation of sporting superheroes. That is your life. God forbid you should be at all self-determining, selfish, or even have any desires of your own. Is that progress? I don't think so. And I would argue there's an appetite to see women as more self-determined, and again, even self-regarding and a little bit selfish. Look at the success of girls. 4 girls in New York, excuse my French, fucking up, being a bit selfish, being a bit narcissistic, but enormously successful. Which brings me to, actually, the wake-up call for Hollywood. So in 2013, female-led films out-earned male-led films by over 30%. So there's clearly an appetite to see female baddies, female megalomaniacs, women achieving, women doing well. So society is catching up, but the way we're portraying women in society is the problem. You know, and maybe it's time for a new narrative around women, because actually, when you think about busy working mum, well, Michelle Obama is a busy working mum, but that actually really underrepresents the power and immense influence that Michelle Obama carries. And if that's true for Michelle, surely that's true for nearly every woman. So, you know, I would argue in favour of the death of the busy working mum, obviously not literally, because it'd be terrible, but a language that defines women not according to her responsibilities, but according to her achievements and aspirations. Wouldn't that be refreshing? You know, actually celebrating women for their achievements, for their dreams, their hopes, their visions, rather than just labelling her and reminding her of her responsibilities. How often do you hear men asked, so how do you combine that busy career with parenthood? Never. But yet as women, we're constantly reminded, don't forget the kids. And this is why I put together the new female tribes. And don't worry, I'm not going to slavishly take you through all of the tribes, because we'll be here all night and I'll bore myself. But what the new female tribes does is, the idea behind it is creating a new narrative around women, which is looking at her achievements, her aspirations, goals and desires. And it proves some things. Firstly, age is no predictor of life stage, so you can't just write women off because they're 50, or maybe predict that because she's 35, she's got 3 kids and she's a housewife. Whether she has children or not doesn't define her. She's plenty more besides. And it recognises female progress. So I'll just show you a couple of examples and hopefully remind you why it's important to look at women in a different way. So firstly, one of the tribes is the second lifer. And this is based on the idea that with life expectancies literally and kind of metaphorically on the rise, there's a tribe of women who may be married in their 20s, they're divorcing in their 40s, and now they're in their 50s, and they're not going to slide into a sea of beige fleece and look after their grandchildren for the rest of their lives. Not so. You know, they might be starting a new career, starting a new business, or starting a new family, adopting. And, you know, this age group is the most entrepreneurial of any demographic. And amongst them, women, again, are the ones more likely to be starting their own businesses. So again, don't think that because she's 50, she might have a few grey hairs, she's not going to be a big spender and decision maker. And then we have new Asian women. So behind every tiger economy, there's a tiger woman. And when you look to Asia, Asian women are really shedding the docile homemaker stereotype we have of Asian women. And 50% of Asian billionaires are women. 34% of all CEOs in Thailand are women. So if you're trying to attract the Asian audience, Asian female audience, portraying her as submissive isn't going to work anymore. And then we have perhaps one of the most polarising of the tribes, the modern courtesan. So young women are creating arrangements that essentially trade their social and sometimes sexual services for financial gain. So you've probably heard about sugar daddy dating. Now, whether you like it or not, what this tribe represents is the way in which women are using their sexuality in a much more empowered way. So if you're talking in the world of beauty to women, maybe let's not think about, you know, she's beautiful so she can please her man. Let's think about beauty as power, as making her stronger. And then we look at the African political class, for example. Now, the African political class really challenge our notions of what is a developed versus developing nation and culture, because if you look to Africa, there are more women in the political corridors of power than anywhere else in the world. Beating America, beating the UK, hands down. So in, for example, South Africa, women make up 46% of the parliament. In the UK, it's around 14%. Quite startling. And the reason why I touch on these tribes is because celebrating female achievement and self-determination fundamentally shifts the conversation. What do I mean? Let's have a look at some examples. So here is, for example, Veet. In the world of beauty, which talks about her responsibility to look good for her man. Isn't that always a good conversation to have? Shall we have a look at the ad?
Yeah, I know. I'm a little prickly. I shaved yesterday.
Don't risk dudeness. Veet wax strips. Feel womanly around the clock.
When I see these ads, it's the time at which I think maybe feminism should become a combat sport. Because these kind of ads make me quite angry. I don't want to go out and buy razors, or if I did, they wouldn't be to shave my legs. And women, it's fair to say, didn't just slightly dislike this ad, they hated it. Not only women, but also gay men, because they said, actually, this is quite insulting, quite prejudicial. So that's one way of talking about beauty. The other way, perhaps, is Oriental Princess. So this Oriental Princess is a cosmetics brand in Singapore and Thailand, and they decided, recognizing new Asian woman, empowered, in control, high salary, etc., they translated beauty into the power derived from being beautiful. So they created a whole mini-series with women who were, murder mystery stars and potential assassins, and you had to solve the murder mystery, and there was digital in action. This was one of the fastest growing campaigns for the brand. They pretty much doubled sales overnight. Enormous participation in this. And again, if you look at, say, for example, Unilever in Japan, or, for example, Pantene in Thailand, we're starting to talk about women and beauty in a much more empowered way. How refreshing. Again, let's look at M&S. Now, the female achievers that they're celebrating in the M&S Leading Ladies is getting a lot of press coverage, if not people running into store buying the products. But I think that's a separate issue. However, this has driven enormous traffic to the website and engagement digitally with the campaign. And again, as a woman, I look at this and I feel very positive about it. It makes me think differently about the M&S brand. And they're celebrating, they've got female sportswomen, women with OBEs, female engineers. Isn't that great? Isn't that refreshing? And another example of changing the conversation is L'Oreal, using Jane Fonda, so celebrating beauty for women in their 70s, so recognising that just because you might have a few wrinkles or you might be in your 70s, you still want to look beautiful. So it's redefining the nature of beauty and democratising beauty much more and celebrating beauty throughout the ages. Again, very refreshing and a new way of talking to women. So this is, the crux of the argument for me is that changing the narrative around women can be game-changing. Thank you.
Okay. So it was interesting when I saw this topic first kind of come up as something to talk about. I thought, I actually, as a woman, I'm not alienated by advertising. So have I missed 40 years of the chance to be really pissed off with the universe? Or, am I not reading something right? Or have I kind of missed the narrative hidden somewhere in the advertising? And I think, you have a lot of emotional reactions to the content of the advertising you see. And I think for me, I feel deeply annoyed and deeply frustrated by a tampon brand, for example, telling me to wear white and cartwheel down the beach. That irritates me. Does it alienate me, though? And I think when I talked about Dove and starting to filter through the brand I work on, I started to go, what is alienation and how does it work? And how does Dove avoid it most of the time? I don't think advertising is the enemy. I don't think there is a silver bullet by which to solve alienation or the topics that women are affected by. But I think Dove gets it pretty right most of the time. no one's actually ever foolproof. That's why this title of this topic is actually more about bringing women into the communications, because I think that's what Dove does actually do really well. It's deliberately not the solutions, 10 steps to never alienate a woman for the rest of your life, but it's how do you actually bring them in. So I wanted to take you today, I'll talk you through a couple of ads from last year, and I'll give you the context on them. But I wanted to talk first about kind of behaviours that are within Dove and how we work with Dove that are kind of changing the things we can get out of the communications. So the first one is probably the most obvious for Dove. It's probably the most obvious in total. It's about avoiding stereotypes. Dove became very famous 10 years ago now, scarily enough, 10 years ago, with the campaign for Real Beauty, which absolutely called out all the stereotypes of the beauty industry, and it took them head on. And stereotypes aren't a bad thing. They're not, they're not at their absolute root, the root of all evil, so I don't want to stand up here and say they are. But they do tend to make us reduce our thinking down and to pinpoint something into a sort of pigeonholed, tight little box that we can say it is this person or that person. And I think what Dove does is it is brave enough to take on those stereotypes very overtly when it did it in the campaign for Real Beauty. So it's slightly less so now because that conversation has actually got some traction. And you see now that the Beyoncés of the world get advertising removed because it's been too retouched. So they stand up against it. You get more brands like L'Oreal that was just referenced, actually embracing age and embracing different kinds of women and presenting them differently. Dove has started that conversation and has been very committed to it. Dove uses real women, has always used real women, no actors, no models, no celebrities, no borrowed interest. So that's a really interesting start point because you have something in the DNA of the brand that says we will not start by stereotyping. We also look to understand the relationship between women and beauty. Now that is a messy space. Women are complicated beings. I can say this because I am one. But it's a really interesting challenge when you start to try and position a brand or your communications in that middle space between the consumer and the product, and you try and live in that middle sort of grey area. So when you set out to say, I don't want to be black or white, but I want to live somewhere in the middle, that kind of creates opportunities and problems. But for example, Dove has spent a lot of time not just studying their products, but studying women and understanding that 96% of the women in the world will not use the word beautiful to describe themselves. It's a language thing, it's a word, but actually that gives you a really interesting grit to start to work your communications from. And they always position themselves with an eye-level perspective, so they're always on the side of the women, which I think is also important. So again, back to the point Jane raised earlier of empathy. They start from a position of we're in a relationship with our target market. And I hate that word too. Applying the whole brain, which I think Dove does, and it's a very female way of approaching problems and approaching life. So advertising at its worst and its start is very linear, very rational. I win, you lose. I'm superior, you're inferior. But very much along that, I will create a problem, I will give you a solution, and you will need this. Dove, not so much. It actually tries to take in the context as much as the culture, as much as the product's efficacy or not, and actually wrap them all up together. So I think what we do is we start from, and it's a global brand, so again, huge amounts of trouble, just trying to unravel that. Because you can't presume to say that a woman in China has the same experience as a woman in America. But what you start to do is you try and find the similarities. So what's common about the world they live in that we can actually start to work with? When I started on Dove, coming from a planner, position in Australia, I got almost blown away by the difference. Because when you start to look at the diversity across countries that this brand operates in, you get lost in the difference. But what's actually more interesting is when you start to find what's common and what actually connects those people in sort of their experience and that shared experience. So when you start from there, it gets kind of more interesting. And actually, it seems bleedingly obvious, so I apologise for the simplicity of it, but thinking about women as humans and understanding the world they live in, I think a lot of times we forget about the rest of the world because it suits us to focus on how they engage with dishwashing liquid or how they do the washing or how they shower. But actually, women don't operate in one nice, neat little silo that's easily compartmentalised. So actually starting to think holistically about them as existing. The other thing that is really interesting, I think this is probably going to be the future for channel planning and media in the approach. Content is really interesting. Movies are really interesting. They've always operated in a storytelling mechanic. They've always operated differently. Differently to advertising, which 30-second linear broadcast, push the message out, see the sales go up. Content's much messier. It's much more organic. It's much more fluid. I would argue it's more female in the way that it kind of has actually structured itself. So trying to think sort of in a media sense, what is actually going to be organically possible. Very hard for marketers because it's not very easy to release stuff out there and see where it goes. And I'll talk about Sketches, a campaign we did last year later, and we adopted this approach. But because women naturally seek those connections and they seek to actually connect over things and talk about them, this kind of an approach that content naturally lets you do starts from a sort of a shared emotion. It starts from what the trigger of the emotional reaction and what's going to be commonly shared. So you start to get automatically from a different angle. It's not to say they don't do 30-second ads, but they actually try and look at the conversation, not just the sort of bit between the pack shot and the start of the ad. Being part of culture. This is probably one of the most powerful things Dove does. I'm saying that to myself and thinking whether that's true. But actually, I think a lot of the time as planners, we forget that our brands live in the world. Again, it seems really obvious, but we sort of think that we spend a lot of time just looking at our category and looking at that piece of the shelf of the supermarket that people buy from. But actually, brands don't operate like that. Brands operate in a much bigger landscape, as people do. And I think a lot of brands step away from having a point of view. There's that risk to the bottom line and there's that risk of the share going down. Dove is very brave, and it really actually does stand at the forefront of that conversation, and it does take a point of view. Very clearly knows what it stands for, and it has stood by that for more than 10 years. It's a 57-year-old brand, I think it is now, and it has had a point of view the whole way through about how to change categories and how to change women's lives. It obviously did it very, very clearly with the campaign for beauty, but I think it's still doing it. And when the two examples that I'll come on to, Camera Shy and Sketches, have done it most recently. But they don't start from what women are. And I think this is a point sort of being touched on by the two previous speakers. If you start from what women are, you never get to think about them as anything else. If you start from where they are and how they live and how they function, you get to a much more interesting insight space from the get-go. So it's kind of little tricks that we sort of employ with Doves. They're not tricks in the sense of manipulations, but sort of little approaches that we take. And I think that is actually what's changing the way they communicate. We use media to activate their natural tendency to want to communicate. Women are talkers. Again, I've probably got to put my watch on for the first time in ages to keep an eye on the time, because there's an ability in us to naturally connect, communicate and share. That, if you apply that over the media lens, actually also will change your behaviours as a brand. And recontextualising your strategy to start new conversations. As I said, the campaign for Real Beauty started 10 years ago. 10 years ago this year, actually, the first white paper was published. It's very hard as a planner to come into a brand that is sort of tightly locked. The strategy is locked in terms of that we don't want to change it. It's working. We've got a really good point of view. We know what we stand for. We don't want to deviate from it. So what you have to do is find what's true in that and recontextualise it. And actually be okay with the fact that it may not turn out exactly like it did 10 years ago, but actually be allowed to let that flex and change occur as it naturally should. Controversially, and I had to clear this with my client, actually, we had a good chat about this point, not shying away from reaction, not backing down from sort of the fight. Because if you start a conversation, you can't actually control where it's going to go. You can't control the fact that somebody might be alienated by it or not alienated by it, might be offended by it or say that's not for me. That actually needs to happen. The brand needs to allow that to be okay, because if you really want to change and create a change, and in this sort of post-feminist world we're still discussing this, but if you really want to provoke a reaction and a change, you have to allow that reaction to happen. And it will always happen. Haters will always be haters, lovers will always be lovers, and you'll always get the people in the middle. And I think you need to allow for that space to happen. Let your consumers carry your communications. I think that's a really interesting one, because I think when you talk to women and how you bring them into that conversation, letting them have ownership and being part of the communications is a really critical thing, because they will actually move it on for you and they will evolve it and make it personal and share different experiences around it. I can never presume to predict exactly what reactions an advertising is going to have, or any communications. But that's part of the joy of working on a brand like Dove, is you have to go, I really hope it's going to have this response, but I have to be okay with the myriad of things that will happen in the middle. I want to talk in a little bit more depth about two campaigns that I think are kind of the most recent examples of bringing this all together for us on Dove. Work I'm very proud of, work I'm very happy to say I was part of, but really interesting kind of proof points in different ways about sort of what Dove stands for and how it operates. The first one is called Dove Camera Shy. And myriads of results around this, so I didn't kind of decide to inundate you with them, but happy to share some more if there are some more. Interestingly, when you start from the point that 96% of women in the world actually don't like how they look, so that's your fundamental sort of start point for the brand. Women today are living in an unprecedented age. No one has ever been as photographed as we as women are right now. So, interesting fact that you think half the women are more scared of having their photo taken than public speaking. So you start to go, there's a behaviour change going on culturally that's actually informed by a lot of different things. Women today will delete more photos than a woman took 5 years ago. You know, just the de-tagging, the deleting. You think about how many times a day you remove an image of yourself and actually what that does for your self-esteem as a result, like what you're expressing openly through it. The interesting thing about both of these ads that we did some sort of study on them, and the fact that I think what made them work incredibly well, lots of things made them work very well, but one of the key things was that they elicited multiple responses, psychologically and emotionally. And I think that's really interesting because, again, women don't just react as I'm happy or sad. They'll have a diversity and a range of reactions within there. And both of these pieces of work actually really strongly over-indexed on multiple emotional reactions, which was something that Unruly, who we did the work with, actually said was sort of what made them shareable. Because you talk about, we spend our lives, what's shareable, what's likeable. That's a huge reason why. 57 million views around the world. This ad worked incredibly well in China. You know, you sort of think, would this ad travel? And yeah, it actually really, the response in China was huge because the insight was very universal to women and something that every woman they could feel they could connect to their mother, their sister, their daughter. And over 60% of them were female. So you can actually quantify the fact that more often than not, again, we didn't want to alienate men. They came into the conversation too, possibly shared it with their wives, girlfriends, lovers. Hopefully this will play okay. This is camera shy.
Kiss you, keep you out of mischief, make your blue sky do, silly to be shy with you, know who. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I'll kiss you. Peekaboo, I love you. Better make your mind up that you love me too, 'cause you're gonna marry, you know who. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I love you. Peekaboo, peekaboo, I love you.
It was released as a digital film, so it wasn't actually broadcast as a really stock standard ad. Once we saw it start to spread, and that was something actually that Unilever are very brave in doing, they kind of really do adopt that organic behavioural approach to respond to the media and the likeability in the conversation. When I first saw that in a script form, not even in the footage form, I went, oh my God, I do that. You kind of, as a female, I went, that's exactly the behaviour I do. And I think that was sort of when you go, that's true and that's going to be shareable. The final one, I think I'm okay on time, the final one I don't want to show was Real Beauty Sketches. Very well seen, very well known, very well talked about, all those wonderful things that we as advertisers and as planners want to get. It was really interesting because it was kind of almost reopening the original Dove conversation. So Dove, after 10 years of the campaign for Real Beauty, had very successfully done a lot of change, done a lot of good to open a new conversation. But you're living in a world where retouching is banned by even publications in France. So actually it's legislated against, it's really hardcore. But actually there's something innately behind that women still kind of hate themselves. You know, unfortunately, we all do. And I said to the creators when I briefed this, I said, look, I can now look at a movie poster and know that Kate Winslet's boobs have been made bigger. I can do that. I can read the articles about Beyonce, that's all fine. But I'll still beat myself up. I will absolutely still beat myself up. And that's just human nature. And no awareness or education will change that. That is still innately female to do. And we went back to the original research from a few years ago, and women identify themselves as their own worst critic. So actually you start to go, God, there's something really interesting going on there, that just in the psychology of women and how they approach it, that is kind of powerful. Again, part of its successes, so it didn't just elicit 1, but 6 psychological responses, so hugely shareable. And what we found was when we looked at sort of how this was passed around the world, it really did go mother to daughter to best friend to sort of bounce around the world. Female connectivity was what was really driving it. The creative was beautiful, but actually it was the woman-to-woman conversation that was more powerful. Third most shared ad ever, 97% like rate. You know, all those stats are great. I mean, you look at them and you think, but actually it was more that it made me cry, it made me react, it made me want to pass it on. So this is Real Beauty Sketches, hopefully.
I'm a forensic artist. Worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board.
We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
Kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
She had blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we are. This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's...
She looks closed off and fatter, sadder too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah. Yeah.
We spend a lot of time as women analyzing and trying to fix the things that aren't quite right. And we should spend more time appreciating the things that we do like.
So there we go. Beautiful piece of work. I think just, my final point would be not to impose an image on people and let your brands be discovered by women, and then I think they will take them and own them, and you will bring them into the conversation.
I'm a bloke. After fashion, but what I want to reassure you about is that a lot of very talented, brilliant women put this presentation together and did all the background research and time-honoured bloke fashion. I've just taken it and I'm getting all the credit for this conversation. This is a project that we did with Mumsnet. They came to us and said, we want to do a conference on marketing to mums, and could you help us out, come up with a name, which was Mumstock, thank you very much, and also provide some research or thinking. And there are lots of things that we could have done, but the thing I really was passionate about trying to get to grips with was a sense that there were a whole bunch of myths about marketing to mums that over my career have really irritated me, and I was going to get this opportunity once and for all to stand up in front of a bunch of clients and tell them that they were getting it wrong, and I really didn't want to let that go. So I constructed a piece of research that combined social listening with the Mumsnet. They have about 4.6 million monthly users, visitors, some work with Ipsos to depth charge it with a bit of quant and to face off against the accusation lots of people have about Mumsnet, which is it's just posh mums, and then also some qualitative research that we did to sort of try and unpack and contextualise what was going on. And so I just want to share that with you today. I did, if you came to the Mumstock event and you liked it, then just sit back and enjoy yourself. If you didn't like it, imagine it's just like really bad sex. It's going to be over very, very soon. There are about 18... I'm not getting it. There are 18 million women in this country who, according to the 2011 census, classify themselves as a mother. And I know that we all love segmentation and that sort of stuff, but that's a fucking enormous group of people to sort of segment off from the rest of society and label in this incredibly simplistic way. So it didn't seem unreasonable to set out and try and understand whether we were doing a decent enough job at talking to them. And if you want a brutal and simplistic headline, it's that we're not really doing a very good job at all. If only 19% of mothers with children, that's women with children, mothers, believe there are any examples of mums in advertising that they can relate to, then there's got to be something pretty rotten in the state of ad land. Only 19% relate to the stuff that we're producing, and it's hardly surprising because this is the diet of creative guano that we feed our mothers on. Here's a news flash for you advertisers. Please, I realise you all have targets to make, stereotypes to depict, money to count, but treat parents as intelligent people, not just as parents. So the research led me to believe that marketing is kind of working according to a series of myths that all of us, clients, agencies alike, are carrying around in our heads about the word or the label mum or mothers, and that if they ever were true, and possibly at some point in 1974 they were, they've long since ceased to be the case. And it really is time that you and I start to challenge this at every part of the process, whether that's the briefs we're taking from clients, their awful segmentation studies and ghastly pen portraits, whether it's the conversations we have with creative teams, knowing what they think every time we put mum on a creative brief. That's where I think we need to be challenging these myths. Now, I said there are 5 myths. There are actually 6. If you go onto the Byzantine and completely unnavigable Saatchi website, there's a white paper with a 6th special myth, just for the people that can be bothered, which is to do with work-life balance and the lack of guilt that working mums now feel about working, which I found fascinating, got a lot of media traction, slightly less relevant to marketing and advertising. Go and have a look. 5 myths. The first one is that the myth that motherhood defines mums. If you look at the output of our industry, you'd imagine that motherhood is all-consuming for mums and an absolutely appropriate label for her lives. It may be for that woman, but she's not particularly representative of women in this country. The real truth is that mums, while feeling that motherhood is an obviously important role and responsibility. It's not an adequate definition of the entirety of their lives, and still less their identity. And if you can't understand the seeming contradiction in the phrase, I'm a mum but I'm not a mum, then it's probably time that you stopped doing work that targets women with children until you have figured that out. I would never define myself as a mum. Of course I'm a mum, but I like to see myself as an independent person. And this is one of my favourite quotes of all from the Qual, and I think it is about the relationship that mums have with their kids, and particularly their daughters. They won't remember the things that I taught them. They'll remember the person that I was. A lot of mums talking about their identity talk about the need to show their children who they are rather than simply teach them. When we asked people, are you happy with people calling your mum? Only a quarter of British mothers are happy with anybody else apart from their families calling them mum. Well, that's not surprising, is it? Because the word mum, I don't know when you last use it, but it's a pet term, a pet name that kids, little kids, once they've grown out of mummy, or in my case that's never, but once they've grown out of mummy, they call their mother mum. It's a term of endearment between children and their mothers, possibly to the kind of tighter family group. You might, as a dad, refer to your partner as mum, mightn't you? But it's not a term to be appropriated and inhabited by the marketing community in a desperate attempt. And we know why it fucking happened, didn't we? Because it looks cooler. We call them mums. We're proud sponsors of mum. It makes it seem like brands and advertisers that are in some way closer to the women they're choosing to target. So motherhood, yes. I mean, it's okay. I admit I'm a bloke. I'm a dad, but I'm a bloke, and I'm channeling other people. So if I've got this wrong, please forgive me. But motherhood is a role and responsibility, but it's not a mother's life in its entirety, and few brands really understand this. I do feel that John Lewis gets close because while it honours and respects, this is it's called Generations, but it's the Always a Woman campaign that they ran a few years ago. While it honours and respects that woman's role as a mother, it also sits it within the many and complex identities that she has. Second myth. Marketing kind of believes that, I mean, do you remember this is from Mary Poppins, where Mary Poppins rather arrogantly, where she measures the kids and finds that they're slightly under par, and then she measures herself and finds that she's practically perfect in every way. And marketers kind of believe that of mothers, that at least mums are seeking perfection, desperately seeking perfection. And guess what? They're looking to brands like ours to help them achieve that, aren't they? That's what they always say. You know, I'm not suggesting that every mum doesn't want to be a good mum. Everyone wants to be a good mum. Dad wants to be a good dad. But kind of good is the word, isn't it? You know, it's about good enough is good enough. That's the nature of modern families. It's not about perfection. And indeed, perfection is increasingly ridiculed. It's certainly not something that people any longer strive for. And in cases, they overtly resent the pretense at perfection. So 74% British mums say they aren't perfect, but then they're not trying to be. And only 9% say they've ever met a perfect mum. There's a very scary geographical difference in London, where we've gathered together some of the most talented, ambitious and driven women on earth, and the number of women in London who striving for perfection in motherhood is slightly higher. But in Britain, it's not the case at all. We all suck the stains out of their rugby shirts and pack them back in the bag because we forgot to wash them. So, you know, let's hear it for messiness, and good is good enough. And let's hear it for brands that prefer to settle themselves into the messy world of family life, because it's a lot more fun than perfection and a damn sight less time-consuming. Now, of course, what you're all saying is, yes, but I work for a trendy ad agency and it's Shoreditch, and we're not like that at all. We totally understand what's going on with modern bubs. Well, I've got these are briefs that Mumsnet received from your clients, and I want to read them to you. She needs constant assurance. Oh, fuck. She needs constant assurance that her home is clean and fresh so she can feel relaxed and in control of her household. It's her duty to create a perfectly clean and organised environment for her family so that they, I don't know why that's in bold, but they can achieve their goals. This mum would say, my greatest reward is when the results of my laundry are perfect, showing off my efforts, meaning I will get recognition from family. I need this feedback to feel reassured I am a good mum. The dad, this is a battery manufacturer. The dad needs batteries for his cameras and gadgets. Mum needs them for practical items such as TV remotes and fire alarms. Oh, and this car will appeal to the most stylish and adventurous outgoing members of insert car brand here. It's a car that will appeal more to dads. And it's easy to laugh at that shit, but those are all briefs that very well-meaning clients have taken to an organisation for Mumsnet, or called Mumsnet, which isn't known for its misogyny, and have happened in the last 6 to 12 months. That was a little interlude. Back to the myths. The third myth. Yes. Marketers seem to believe that mums are paragons of saintly virtue. You know, marketing mum, she doesn't swear, she doesn't drink a little bit too much on a Monday night, she doesn't laugh at the same thing as other adults, she doesn't talk about sex, and she certainly doesn't have sex, which is more than a little ironic. I've lost count. I've lost count of the number of clients who've said, our mums don't really like edgy humour. They prefer the Vicar of Dibley. I mean, that's a genuine Weetabix brief. And I kind of go, but it's been off air since 2007. Are they really late in catching up on their Sky Plus? And then you go, hold on. The average age of first child in the UK right now is just shy of 30. If that child is now 10, then that mum was 20 at the height of the dance and drugs culture of the mid-1990s. She wasn't watching Vicar of Dibley. Sorry to break this to you, but mums are adults too, with the same humour, same desires, frustrations as other adults. And they've got a dark and sometimes dirty sense of humour. And you only have to have followed the penis speaker thread on Mumsnet to know about that. Don't try Googling penis speaker. That's the best I could do. It looks quite uncomfortable to me, to be honest. But anyway, and if you want a sense of how mums entertain each other and the language and humour they use, then just go and sit on some of those threads for a bit, and you'll find out. And of course, at the heart of this, there's a sense that the real enemy here is becoming mumsy. It's almost like, I'm a mother, but I'm not mumsy. Only 30% of mums say that motherhood has made them more mumsy, and only 28% say that motherhood has made them more reserved and to constrain their behaviour. Just because I'm a mum, it doesn't mean I've had a humour bypass operation. Doesn't make me less of a mum with what comes out of my mouth. I swear, make jokes and talk about sex more than the average person. There's absolutely no effect on my parenting skills. Of course it fucking doesn't. So could we stop treating mums like children? They're surrounded by enough of those people, little people, for us to treat mums like children. This ad, it's a US ad for Old Spice. It gets a lot of criticism for portraying the mums in a really mumsy way, which feels like it was a massive own goal. But that insight about the morbid fear that mothers have that their sons will one day grow up and fall in love with women that aren't them is a nice kind of sense of what she finds funny and amusing and interesting about life with teenage boys. Talking about teenage boys, this brings us to the useless dad. This is not about marketing to dads at all. This is about saying, we as a community still seem to think that we can empathise with mums and curry favour with them by portraying their partners as clowns at best and part-time idiots at worst. But when I talk to mothers, they're talking increasingly about partners being full partners. I mean, the clue's in the name. Full partners in parenthood. And shock horror that they might even be starting to pull their weight. I think it's a really difficult subject because a lot of mums kind of recoil at the thought that their other half is remotely helpful. I think what's going on is that family life has been really tough for the last few years, and there's a real sense that families have had to pull together to get through the last 5, 6, 7 years. And there's a phrase that somebody came up with at this Mumsnet conference, which was #TeamFamily. But I think it's really important to understand mums in the context of the whole of the family and the role and their partner plays and the way that he or she fits into that family life, working as a team. Because 60% of British mums right now are saying their partner is as involved in parenting as they are. And I'm sure you'll want to throw things at me, but 25% of mothers think their partner isn't, only 25% of mothers think their partner isn't doing enough around the house. The bumbling husband, clever wife adverts are just cringeworthy. They were probably funny a few years ago, but now it's just another stereotype and a boring one at that. Or this, sorry, long quote, but I fucking love it. I'm not the only parent in my household. There happens to be an adult male living here too, who is equally involved in the creation of the small people. He's fully functioning, responsible adult who's perfectly capable of being with, not looking after or babysitting, but being with his children. There's no better example of this, I think, right now than the Robinson's Pals ad. You'll know it's the one where two boys have the most amazing, wonderful day together. They get home, they get down, collapse on the sofa, slake their thirst with some Robinson's squash, and then the camera cuts back and we realise that one of the boys was a dad all along. That recognises not the way to market to dads, but the way to talk about dad's parenting and the importance of dad's parenting well to mums. The only sadness I have about this is right now I just can't imagine the ad where we go right the way through it and realise at the end that that relationship was between a mother and her daughter or a mother and her son. It feels like that's still beyond us. Which brings us to our final myth for today. Marketers seem to believe that motherhood is a life of frazzled drudgery with the odd moment of saintly pride. You know, the switching off the light at the end of the day with the beatific children sleeping soundly in their cots. Indeed, it is still our preferred option when trying to empathise with mothers. We still do the whole kind of, it's that image of the mobile phone under the baby, the mixing bowl, she's juggling, she's time poor, all that sort of redundant nonsense about motherhood. And if there's only one provocation, and I admit it's a provocation that I'd love you to take away from today, it is simply that motherhood is potentially the most fun you can have with your clothes on. It's hard, it's fucking hard. I understand that sometimes it's overwhelmingly difficult, and it can be right the way through the experience of motherhood, from day to day, from hour to hour, but it's pretty much the most fun you can have with your... They used to say this about advertising before procurement departments made it really miserable business to be in. Because, you invite into your life the funniest, most loving human beings, and you end up crying with laughter much more than you cry with frustration or pain that the little fuckers still haven't put their shoes on and you need to be out of the door. They're not clean their teeth. It's about the banter, but none of us really, we just made an ad for one of our clients, which is all about bringing peace to family mealtimes, but it sort of stops at the piece. It doesn't then explore, the banter and family life that goes on when mealtime goes really, really well. 60% of mums say the best fun they have is with their kids, and 60% also say that their kids are more fun to spend time with most of the adults that they know. And you could interpret this in a negative way, but I choose to see this as a glorious representation of where family life is getting to in this country, that actually it's enormously good fun to spend time with your children. You don't want to be, to have additional time, I don't know, labour-saving device to get the washing done more quickly. You want to spend the time mucking about with your kids. That's why you had them in the first place. So why can't we recognise that being a mum is sometimes just really good fun? There was a greetings card viral that went round around Mum's Day or whatever in the US, saying that wanted people for the hardest job in the world, that completely reduced motherhood to a sort of drudgery chore. So before, though, you go off and follow the timely advice of Mr. Bill Hicks that anybody in marketing and advertising should just go and kill yourselves, I think a little bit like has been said before, it's not, particularly by Jane, it's not marketing's fault alone. It's not advertising's fault alone. I mean, I think society's got a pretty fucked up view of what motherhood is all about. There's only one thing I've done for the cause of feminism. It will simply be getting the Mail online to print a headline saying, modern mums aren't guilty about working. I see that as a personal triumph to get that rag to print something positive about motherhood. It's society that uses this label. It's culture that fills it with nonsense, and it's the media that persecutes mums on an almost daily basis. There is a desperate need for society to recognise that this mum label hides enormous fault lines in motherhood. And do you know what? They aren't between mums that work at home and mums that seek paid employment at all. Their attitudes on a lot of this stuff are surprisingly similar. The real fault lines are the ones you'd expect in a deeply divided society. They're about geography, ethnicity, class, education level, and that is what we ought to be exploring. I'd like to understand what your strategy for mums in London is in relation to your strategy for mums in other parts of the country. It's that sort of thing that seems really, really important, and that we recognise the individuality and diversity of motherhood. I feel that Sheryl Sandberg's sort of going in the right direction with this this project she's doing with Getty Images to try and provide a better representation of women and mothers, in particular in stock photography. But I also think it's desperately important for marketing to start to recognise the reality of mums' lives and engage with and empathise with real mothers and not the fetid pen portraits that clients carry around in their heads, and then planners carry around in their heads, and then creative directors carry around in their heads, and then the director carries around in his head, and then they spew all over our television as we saw before. And if this little three-letter word is becoming increasingly useless when it comes to creating anything of worth, perhaps we should banish it altogether. And exercise it from our creative briefs and from our strategies and from our segmentations. And maybe, like Rachel's talking about female tribes, understand that there's a much richer picture behind there. I personally prefer the idea of talking about women with children, because that forces you as a planner and as a creative team to think about the woman first and the role she is playing and label she's been given second. Thank you.
Don't go. Can we have the speakers up on the stage, please? Because I think you may have one or two questions. It's a fantastic rip-roaring run around the issues there, and I think engaged all of us in a vision for how it could be better, as well as mired us again in some of the problems, which I think we're a long way from solving. But thanks to all our speakers for an amazing start to that. Anybody got a first question for this evening? If you haven't, I would like to ask you, will we be here in 10 years' time having the same conversation? And if not, what better conversation will we be having and why? That's a long question, but if you can answer some of that or have a perspective on it, we'd be very interested. Jane? No?
I think I think things have changed in the last 10 years, certainly, because we set up our company 8 years ago. And when we first started talking to clients, they literally had no idea what we were talking about and said, why would you need a specialism in understanding women, even talking about gender difference was really politically incorrect. Americans hated us, thought that we were basically reducing women. You know, it was a really difficult initial conversation to have, whereas now we go in, well, more often we're invited in, which is always nice, rather than just kind of bashing down doors. But I think people are more accepting that there's a need to do something different for women, and for women to be understood in their own right, rather than be basically treated exactly the same way men are. So that's changed. I think the big change that will need to happen in the next 10 years is women reaching much more senior levels in organisations, so that the culture of those organisations shifts quite seismically. And once that happens, if that ever happens, then change will happen. But there are huge barriers to that happening.
I think also it's, you know, there's the financial aspect, the financial imperative to this, and I think, you know, maybe Hollywood will pick up on this first. So we'll see this entering pop culture, and then it'll filter maybe into brand culture. So I think, you know, when you see there are now female buddy movies, and, you know, if you haven't seen the film The Heat, go see it, because, you know, to see Sandra Bullock, America's sweetheart, making vagina jokes like dick jokes, you know, that immediately tells you something about the way in which, you know, Hollywood culture is even waking up to the way in which women are changing. And I think then, you know, we'll have more of an appetite, it will feel more normal. And I think, you know, advertising, we tend to steal from the art world, from pop culture, from film culture, and I like to think that will infuse brand culture as well.
I kind of think we won't be. Well, I kind of hope we won't be, which sounds like a muddled answer. But I think if you look at the feminist conversation that's happening now, it's actually harking back to the conversation of 40 years ago in a lot of ways. And I kind of feel sad that that hasn't moved on, and sad that the conversation hasn't changed. And I almost, not hope, but predict that in about 10 years we'll be talking about why men are alienated by advertising. Because I kind of think the conversation needs to evolve away from women as this big blob who are left out of stuff. You know, I'd love to hope that it becomes a more sort of expansive definition of that. I think that's my hope. So I think if we're still having exactly the same conversation that we've been having for about 40 years, I'll be really gutted, and I hope I'm not going to be here to see it. But you kind of, I feel that it's very easy to say it's a women's problem, and I think, yes, it is, and yes, it has been, but I think it's going to become a broader problem. I think, you know, we'll all be standing here saying, why are men left out of advertising, and Richard will be the one man on the stage, you know, hopefully, in 10 years' time.
Pick up on this, Richard?
Well, it's an imperative that we sort this out from purely in terms of the effectiveness of our brands and advertising, but I'm deeply pessimistic. We put together a reel of ads from 1970 and then ads from 2014, and they're remarkably similar, and yet the number of women in our industry and client and agency side and in the industries that make our work for us is grown exponentially. And you know, I don't want to say, what the fuck were you doing? But the mums, for my little bit,
what
you know,
the fuck are you doing?
I just, I despair of those meetings, pre-production meetings with a female ECD and a female director and a female TV researcher and a female producer, where we look at a casting list and it's just men. I'm done with it. I'm really fed up. I've just had it on a project we're about to make, and go, why is it me that has to go? Excuse me, why is every single protagonist in a 4-ad strong campaign a bloke? I just don't get it. It's got to be.
What is going on in agencies? Because I always thought agencies are more enlightened than...
I think we're still beset, and it's the case with ethnicity, it's the case with sexuality, is with gender. We're still have these extraordinary cultural blinkers that means we automatically write, you know, and accidentally you end up with an ad which got a woman in the kitchen serving some sausages. I mean,
I think also we're quite condescending, because we think that, you know, I'm different and I work in marketing, but actually, you know, north of Watford, it's, you know, the little people are still living those same stereotypical lives. And actually, I think...
Yeah, I mean, I love that repurposed Ogilvy's quote about the consumer's not a more and she's your wife, and the consumer's not more and she's you. And I kind of think, you know, we ought to be bringing ourselves into our work more rather than saying, actually, I'm not representative. I know, Jane, you have a slightly different point of view about that we are kind of freaks in a sort of, advertising bubble, and we don't really understand real life.
Well, I think there was a real missed trick in advertising. I don't think it was led by the agencies. I think it was the clients who pushed it, which stopped planners actually doing their own research. Because I think having planners kind of properly sit with the people who are going to be consuming the advertising had a profoundly positive effect on the communication ultimately, and also reined in some of the more sort of obscure and some of the more, I feel very detached. I feel the advertising is quite detached. I spend a lot of time talking to women about advertising, and more than being alienated, women just can't think of any. So I say at the beginning of every single group I do, can anybody think of any ads they've seen recently that they like? And they really struggle to think of any advertising, either that they like or that they can remember having seen. Whereas I felt that there used to be a few more kind of brands. I mean, Dove gets mentioned, and John Lewis gets mentioned, but it feels like there is some disconnect there for sure, And I don't think it helps that advertising agencies are a bit like politicians are in London and in their own quite kind of self-supportive network. I think there are lots of good things about that, but I think one of the big downsides is that unless you have people in those agencies outside of that bubble, you're not bringing in any sort of proper fresh impetus from the outside. And so you can get stale, which is partly why the female thing gets stale.
Over here.
So there's a new ad that's just come out for Nivea Men that suddenly repositions the man as a much more like female and mother-like figure. Do you think that actually, in some ways, the question can be flipped? So why are men being alienated by the advertising that's aimed at them, and actually they would prefer to see a much more female, as portrayed by advertising, kind of way of looking? Sorry, I haven't worded that very well. A way of looking at things that feels more Dove-like for them. So there's a book called The Athena Doctrine that looks at that, and it kind of pushes it all towards that. So what are your views on that? That was a terribly worded question. Kate, you're nodding. So
I'm going, that's kind of like how I answer things. I would, that's why I predict if I jump forward 10 or 15 years, I think, and Richard raises a good point, it's sex, it's genders, it's everything in between. I think women, because feminism happened so relatively recently, it's a very kind of emerging topic, and I think we probably aren't seeing the full impact of it. I don't know whether, in corporations, in brands, in all sorts of things. I think we're now going to reach a stage where it does become a male conversation. Because if I look at the personal care category, it is all the Gillette ad. It is all defined as that still very stoic, very heroic, very, masculine coding. And men's roles is changing, and I think, at some point that balance will need to be redressed. I don't know when it will happen, but I do think we're at a little bit of a tipping point on gender stereotyping in general.
And it depends what market you're talking about. I think that might be true. I think in some markets at the moment, but I think if I'm talking to most women most of the time, and they're fairly sort of average mid-market women, their lives are pretty. Men tend to play the men role. Women quite often play the more traditional female role. That's the sort of reality for a lot of the women that I speak to. But there may well be an audience of men who feel that misrepresents them, and they want.
Yeah, and I guess it will happen in waves in the same way that the impact of your feminist arguments did, because, if you talk about Dub, you talk about the codes that they were brought up with and what changed and what they lived through versus women in India or women in China. Really different, completely different life stages of that conversation. And I think, it will happen in different waves and phases.
Yeah.
But I think in the same way that the more men participate in parenthood, so you've got, say, city fathers now, then the more women will be freed from just being viewed through as responsible for childcare. So I think it will democratise the whole way in which we look at people.
But that's a huge and slow-moving beast. It's really slow-moving. It's faster in London than it is anywhere else.
Let's take another question.
Really slow.
Here? Oh,
I'm not sure.
one of you.
So I'm a mother. I was squirming through some of those presentations, and I'm a mother, and I founded Flamingo, and I've grown a company. But the thing I'm probably proudest of is being a mother. The thing that's been most fulfilling in my life is motherhood. So I think we have to be a little bit careful with some of the things that we're saying. And Richard, I'm confused by how we can say that 60% of mothers say they would rather spend time with their children than anyone else. And various other statistics, and then you said, and then I think we should get rid of of mums. So the thing that's most fulfilling in their life, but we're not going to reference it. So I think we have to be a bit careful about what we're saying. Two other things: Scandi drama. Look to Scandinavia. There's where we've got fantastic female role models. We've got them starring. We've also, of course, got a political system that's representing women. It's a culture shift, and it's then represented on the screen. I'm not sure Sandra Bullock in Gravity quite does it for me, personally. And, you know, I suppose the question, the other thing I just wanted to say was the Dove campaign doesn't reference motherhood at all. It gets to a truth about women. And it absolutely bypasses whether they're mothers or not mothers, and it gets to women. And it feels very real, and it feels very true, and I think the Dirt is Good work often feels very, very real and very true as well. And you actually bypass a lot of this noise and stuff that I think is maybe getting in our way. So I think mothers are proud to be mothers. I don't know why we're trying to run away from it. It's part of a defining dimension. It's just that it's in a context of another life, and there's other feelings and drivers and motivations that you can tap into. But I suppose my question is, why are you saying take it out of the brief? Why are we looking like we don't want to talk about it anymore? And why are we implying that almost mothers don't want to be engaged as mothers at all? Because I really, really do not think that's true.
Mothers want to be engaged as mothers, as part of the many identities they have. What I'm arguing is that we've got to stop putting mum in creative briefs and in many other places, but the creative brief is the major problem because it's that transition between thinking and doing. At one level, I still believe that you don't get to call her mum. That's something that is a relationship that's between her children and her. That's the first issue. It's sort of philosophical. The second one is very practical, which is it's like a magnet. The word mum is like a magnet for appalling assumptions and stereotypes. It's just ceased to be any use in our industry. Because we know that, like I was saying the other day, that I'm not allowed. If I wrote into a creative brief, target audience car buyers, or target audience, mobile phone consumers, I'd be shocked. But I can write in a creative brief, mums with kids aged 12 to 16. I get away with that because that's seen as, by using the word mum, I've added some sort of insight into, or target audience definition. And yet it's pretty fucking useless if there are 18 million people that identify themselves as a mother. It's about the way we behave, not about how mothers feel about their role.
And if the only role we ever celebrate women as is mothers, then it's a very reductive way of looking at women. And I think you might be a mother, but equally you have your own aspirations and dreams and hopes. And I think the pitfall with just referring to women as mums is you exclude all the other things she is, but also it can be used lazily as a very reductive term. So you're not talking to the woman within. I think that's the trap that we're identifying here.
One final question, I think over there we missed you out before.
I just want to say thank you very much, first of all, because I'm feeling very inspired and rejuvenated to go back to the agency and fight the good fight. We've actually, from a planning perspective, created a brand which does celebrate achievements and celebrates women as self-determining, but we're having some problems translating that into the creative. So I really like this idea of systemizers and empathizers. I'm a complete empathizer, and I think I'm talking to some, deeply avowed systemizers. So have you got any tips or advice about how I can try and translate that or get them to understand what we're trying to do with women?
Jane?
I mean, we try to, which should be obvious from the presentation, but we use a lot of data. We use the language of systemizers. So I guess we sort of codify empathy. That doesn't sound a bit sort of strange. But I think with systemizers, it's really helpful if you can get them, and sometimes they're really reluctant to do this, but if you can get them to talk to or attend, and I don't mean through a mirror, but attend the group sitting in the living room with women if they don't interrupt, which they do sometimes interrupt. But kind of a first-hand experience listening to it can sometimes break the sort of disbelief thing. And always just making the business case, with systemizers as well, constantly referring to the business rationale, why it's important to do things differently, why it's important to kind of change the formula. But use language very carefully. There's a very, Deborah Tannen does some really good work on male to male and female to female conversations, where she talks about the kind of patterns and subject matter that exist in those two different conversations. And we use that a lot because we spend a lot of time in meetings with lots of men, basically, and maybe only one woman. So we have to sort of use the language of the systematic in order to get the empathetic onto the table. But that's quite a helpful sort of summary of the different sorts of ways that you can converse, slightly like learning a different language. But if you're very, very empathetic, it's very, very difficult because the systemizers think that you're just going on and, what's all this subtext she's going on about? And you're thinking, they're so brutal and simplistic about everything. So it is about developing a different conversation or even just talking to them about the fact that, look, I think we have a bit of a styles difference here. You're like this, I'm like this. How can we, meet the business objective by, acting more productively? It's not easy.
Are you talking about creatives?
Yeah, I was going to...
Briefing creatives? Yeah. I mean, and I think I find that one of the most useful things is loads of examples, because there's not a single creative team in London anywhere else that doesn't wish they made beauty sketches. And I find that I'm thinking it a bit like this. It's really helpful in that conversation, because good work that opens up their mind to what the solution could be is really, really helpful.
And if they're fully paid up members of the Hoxton Skateboard Club as creatives, then, get them outside of Hoxton to meet real women. My mother-in-law, my mother-in-law is 60. She was on Greenham Common. She wears Converse. She shops at Topshop. She goes to festivals and can probably out-party me and everybody else. And she, there are a lot of women like her. So, and she probably confounds every expectation of 60-plus suburban women that there is, and she's not alone. So just get them to meet those women.
And on that note, thanks again to all our speakers. And I think they might be hanging around for 5 or 10 minutes.
They're crisp.
Yeah.